The sky above the city was painted in blood and ash. Darkened clouds hung like an ominous veil over the charred ruins. Remnants of humanity's last stand. Silence reigned as the alien king descended, a titan clad in obsidian armor, his cape trailing like shadowy tendrils. The streets trembled under the weight of his landing, fissures spiderwebbing outward. He stood tall and imperious, scanning the shattered remnants of Earth's resistance. Then, with a voice that resonated like a storm, he issued his challenge. "Bring forth your finest warrior!" The king's voice echoed, his tone dripping with contempt. "Let this final duel decide the fate of your pitiful species." From the rubble emerged a lone figure, scarred, lean, and clad in worn battle gear. His eyes were sharp, his movements precise. This was Captain David Reed, a veteran of countless skirmishes, yet this was unlike any fight he'd faced before. There were no cheers or words of encouragement from the scattered survivors watching from the shadows. They knew this was a death sentence. Reed knew it too, but there was no fear in his gaze, only grim determination. The king's lips curled into a smirk. "This is what your species offers? A broken man clinging to his final breaths? I expected more." Reed rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck with a casual air. "You wanted humanity's best. Here I am. Let's see if you're ready for what that means." With a roar, the king surged forward, a blur of mass and power. The ground buckled beneath each of his steps, shattering concrete as he closed the distance. His first swing, a hammer-like blow, was meant to end it instantly. But Reed was already moving, ducking low and sidestepping with fluid precision. The wind from the blow whipped against his face as the king's fist crashed into the ground, sending debris flying. "You're fast for a dying breed," the king snarled, his eyes narrowing. Reed didn't respond with words. Instead, he countered, driving his elbow into the alien's armored ribs with a calculated strike. The king barely flinched, but Reed's intention wasn't to overpower him, it was to probe, to analyze the gaps in his defenses. Every movement was deliberate, each dodge and counter an attempt to gather intel. He wasn't just fighting, he was learning. As the battle raged, the king's strikes became more furious, his frustration evident. He was used to overwhelming his opponents with sheer force. But Reed was different. He was a ghost, slipping through each attack, testing weaknesses, and chipping away at the king's patience. "Fight me like a warrior!" the king roared, swinging wide again. Reed ducked, a narrow dodge that put him inches away from a crushing blow. His eyes were cold and calculating as he muttered under his breath, "You're predictable." The king's arrogance faltered for the first time. He had dismissed this human as just another primitive creature, yet here he was, unbroken, unfazed, and unsettlingly composed. What he saw now wasn't mere defiance. It was confidence, a subtle, simmering confidence that belied something more dangerous than strength, cunning. "You're not the first to think you're invincible," Reed said, his voice calm. "You won't be the last to find out you're wrong." For a moment, there was a flicker of doubt in the king's eyes. But it was brief. With a thunderous growl, he prepared for another all-out assault, determined to crush this insolent human. Yet as the dust settled and the battlefield grew quiet once more, there was an undercurrent of unease rippling through the air. This duel was no longer just a test of strength. It had become a battle of wits, and the king was starting to realize he might have underestimated his opponent. The tension hung like a razor's edge, setting the stage for what was to come. Reed's lips curled into a faint smirk as he tightened his grip on the knife at his side. The king might have the strength, but Reed had something far more valuable, a plan. The king's rage rippled through the air like thunder. He bared his teeth, the glint of serrated fangs catching the fading sunlight. This time, there would be no holding back. He was done toying with this human, done with the calculated jabs that had gnawed at his pride. With a snarl, he launched himself forward, fists crackling with energy that surged through the fractured concrete beneath them. Reed shifted his weight, tracking the king's movements with the precision of a sniper. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, but he held his ground, eyes sharp as steel. Every muscle in his body coiled, ready to spring at the slightest opening. The king was fast, inhumanly fast, but brute force had its limits. Reed had studied the patterns, memorized the gaps in those sweeping arcs. He wasn't facing a mindless beast. He was facing a warrior bound by arrogance and tradition. The ground exploded as the king's fist met empty space, a crater forming where Reed had been. The warrior rolled smoothly to the side, his movements fluid and economical. The king spun, lashing out with a backhand that cut through the air with a deafening crack. Reed ducked, feeling the wind shear past his scalp, but this time, he struck back, hard. His knife flashed as it found a gap in the king's armor, embedding itself just beneath the shoulder joint. The king roared in pain and fury, staggering back a step. For the first time, blood, thick and black, oozed from the wound. Reed didn't waste a second. He withdrew the blade and pivoted, aiming a swift kick at the king's knee. The joint buckled slightly, forcing the towering alien to brace himself. The king's eyes blazed with renewed hatred, and in that moment, Reed knew he'd struck more than flesh. He'd pierced the king's belief in his invincibility. "You think your tricks will save you, human?" The king spat, voice dripping venom. "I've raised worlds, shattered empires. You're nothing but a pest delaying the inevitable." Reed's expression remained calm, though his breathing grew more labored. "I've heard a lot of talk from dead men. You'll fit right in." There was no time to register the insult. The king surged forward, abandoning finesse for sheer ferocity. The blows came faster now, relentless and devastating. Reed dodged and deflected as best he could, but the pressure was mounting. One misstep, and it would be over. Sweat slicked his brow as he danced along the edge of disaster, every movement calculated to stay just one step ahead. But it was more than just survival. Reed's mind was racing, analyzing the rhythm of the fight, the king's tendency to favor his right side, the micro-delays before each strike. He wasn't just enduring, he was learning, adapting. Every second was an opportunity to turn the tide. Then it happened, a brief hesitation, a fraction of a second where the king overcommit. Reed saw his chance. He feinted left, drawing the king's follow-up swing, then spun low, slicing the back of the king's ankle with surgical precision. The alien staggered, his balance faltering, and Reed drove his shoulder into the king's side, sending him crashing to the ground. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The king, breath heaving, scrambled to his feet, eyes wide with disbelief. No one had ever brought him to his knees. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. This human was no mere soldier. He was a tactician, a predator who had been testing his prey all along. The king's snarl deepened into something darker, more dangerous. He rose, slower this time, wiping blood from his lip with a trembling hand. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. "I'll grind your bones into dust before this is over." Reed straightened, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe. But you're bleeding now." The tension ratcheted higher as they squared off again, either willing to give an inch. The fight wasn't just physical anymore, it was a battle of wills, and both knew the next exchange would decide everything. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The stage was set for the final reckoning, and only one would walk away. Dust settled as the two warriors squared off, a quiet lull hanging in the air before the storm. Both combatants bore the marks of their fierce battle. Reed's brow was slick with sweat, while the alien king's armor was marred with fresh cracks. But the king's arrogance was fading, replaced by something colder, desperation. "You've done well to survive this long, human," the king sneered, masking his unease. "But you can't win. You fight alone, without the strength of your kind. This is your end." Reed's eyes narrowed, his grip on his knife tightening. He could feel the weight of every moment pressing in. "You don't get it, do you?" he replied, voice calm yet edged with steel. "It's never been about fighting alone. It's about standing when others can't." The king's expression twisted in fury, his composure cracking like his armor. He charged again, faster this time, abandoning all semblance of strategy in favor of raw power. The ground trembled as he unleashed a flurry of blows, each strike a maelstrom of energy that threatened to obliterate everything in its path. Reed darted left and right, evading the onslaught with razor-thin precision, his focus absolute. But he was tiring, his movements less fluid, each dodge coming a fraction slower. The king saw the strain and pressed harder, grinning wickedly. I see it now! Your strength is fading. You're just like the rest, fragile, breakable. But Reed wasn't listening to the taunts. His mind was locked on the rhythm of the fight, searching for the crack that would finally tip the scales. Amid the chaos, he spotted it, the king's wounded shoulder, slightly lagging with each swing. It was a tiny detail, almost imperceptible, but for Reed, it was the key. He feigned a stumble, letting the king's fist skim past his ribs, baiting him into overextending. The alien took the bait, roaring as he drove forward for a finishing blow. Reed twisted at the last moment, dropping low and pivoting around the king's exposed side. With one precise thrust, he buried his knife deep into the weakened joint, twisting hard. The king bellowed in agony, staggering as his arm went limp, the wound crippling his movements. You! The king snarled, eyes wide with fury and disbelief. For the first time, fear flickered beneath his rage. You can't! Reed didn't let him finish. He drove forward, capitalizing on the opening with relentless strikes aimed at every chink in the king's armor. Each hit was calculated, methodical, stripping away the king's strength and confidence. The towering alien stumbled backward, each step a retreat, the unthinkable dawning on him. He was losing. The king's desperation morphed into a primal, guttural scream. He summoned his remaining energy, channeling it into one last devastating attack. The ground splintered as he unleashed a shockwave, intending to crush Reed beneath its force. But Reed was already in motion, diving into the chaos with everything he had left. The blast singed his skin, the pressure nearly knocking him off his feet, but he pushed through, eyes locked on the king's vulnerable chest. With a final, defiant shout, Reed drove his knife into the center of the king's chest plate, piercing through to the alien's heart. The king's eyes went wide in shock, his body freezing mid-motion. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then, with a shuddering gasp, the alien's strength drained away. He collapsed to his knees, eyes still locked on Reed in disbelief. How? The king whispered, voice weak, disbelief tinged with a mix of bitterness and awe. You're just human. Reed stood over him, breathing hard but unbroken. You should have figured that out by now. We don't quit. The king's gaze wavered, and with one last, rasping breath, he slumped forward, lifeless. The battlefield fell silent, the oppressive tension evaporating as the king's towering presence faded into nothingness. But Reed didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, staring down at his fallen foe, a mix of exhaustion and grim satisfaction in his eyes. The fight was over, for now, but the war was far from won. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the scene. Reed wiped the sweat from his brow and turned toward the ruins, ready to face whatever came next. The stillness that followed the king's fall was unsettling, a silence heavy with the echoes of the battle just won. Reed's muscles ached, his breathing ragged as he stood over the fallen alien monarch. But there was no time to rest. He knew this victory was only the beginning. As the sun's last light slipped below the horizon, Reed's calm crackled to life. Reed, come in! A familiar voice called, a mix of static and urgency. Alive and kicking, Reed replied, wiping blood from his brow. Mission accomplished, but I'm not done yet. Good, the voice said, relief evident. But we're picking up movement, reinforcements, a whole battalion heading your way. You need to pull out. Reed's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze to the distant hills, where the faint glow of approaching dropships could already be seen. Let them come, he muttered, eyes steely. But as much as he craved another fight, he knew that sticking around would be suicide. The victory wasn't just in slaying the king, it was in making it back to inspire others. With a quick breath, Reed knelt beside the fallen king, yanking free his bloodied knife. The alien's lifeless eyes stared back at him, empty and defeated. But in that cold gaze, Reed found a final, twisted respect. You were wrong about us, he whispered, a hint of bitterness in his voice. We're not fragile. We're relentless. The sound of engines roared in the distance, drawing closer. Reed scanned the darkening sky. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and alone. But fear was a distant memory. He'd long since traded it for purpose. Command, what's our extraction window? 2 minutes, but you'll need to move fast. They're deploying heavy armor, too much for even you to take on solo. Copy that. Reed sheathed his knife and started running. Each step was a reminder of his exhaustion, but he pushed through, driven by more than survival. He was fighting for something larger than himself, for the stubborn defiance that burned in every human heart. As Reed sprinted across the battlefield, he heard the hum of the enemy's dropships drawing closer. From the ridge above, spotlights swept across the ruins, searching for their target. Reed ducked behind a crumbling wall, his mind racing. He could hear the clatter of armored troops disembarking, their weapons charging with a low whine. They were closing in, tightening the noose. But Reed had one last trick up his sleeve. He unclipped a small device from his belt, a beacon rigged with a frequency jammer. Activating it would scramble the enemy's sensors just long enough to create confusion. With a grim smile, he set the timer and hurled it into the open. The device skidded across the dirt, blinking softly. Let's see how you like fighting blind, Reed muttered. He bolted from cover just as the beacon went off. The air filled with static as enemy comms jammed, and the dropship's searchlights flickered erratically. Shouts of confusion echoed as the alien troops stumbled, disoriented. Reed took advantage of the chaos, sprinting toward the extraction point, adrenaline fueling every stride. In the distance, a dropship swooped low, its bay doors open. Reed could see the welcoming lights inside, his ticket out. But the enemy wasn't about to let him go that easily. Gunfire erupted, tracer rounds slicing through the air. Reed zigzagged, dodging the deadly barrage, feeling the heat of plasma rounds grazing past him. He was close, just a few more meters. A sharp sting tore through his side as a round clipped him. Pain flared, but Reed didn't slow down. He clenched his teeth, pushing through the agony. The dropship was now within reach, its thrusters kicking up a storm of dust. Reed, jump! The pilot's voice crackled in his earpiece. With a final burst of energy, Reed launched himself into the open bay, landing hard but safe. The doors slammed shut, and the ship rocketed skyward. As they ascended, Reed caught a glimpse of the battlefield below, scattered troops, disoriented and leaderless, scrambling in vain. He leaned back, catching his breath as the adrenaline finally wore off. The pain in his side was sharp, but it was bearable. He'd lived to fight another day. More importantly, he'd lived to tell the tale, a story that would light a fire in the hearts of those still resisting. The pilot glanced back at him. You did it! You took down the king! Reed nodded slowly, eyes hard with determination. Yeah, but the real fight's just beginning. As the dropship soared into the night, leaving the battlefield behind, Reed knew one thing for sure. Humanity wasn't just surviving. They were proving, time and again, that when it came to determination and grit, nothing in the galaxy could match them.